Great. For the rest of today, we're going to talk about what the Romans do with their city and how they build it in different stages and the different kinds of technology that they use, which becomes, especially with concrete, extremely innovative and start building on a much larger scale than really any other ancient civilization up to that point. So it's extremely impressive, and there's many books on Roman architecture that have been written, and a lot of the things that they build are still around today. So it's has a major impact on their civilization. And of course, when they're building these gigantic buildings that are going to be there for a long time, they're going to be used for government offices and whatnot. It expands not just the role that the government plays in daily life, but people see the government's influence on what we call the kind of built society, the buildup of this physical space. It sends a message about how powerful the government is and how stable it is for the long term, which can often kind of get into society and convince people to accept government decision making, because this is such a powerful entity that a lot of people do not want to oppose. So we've seen this map before. The empire under Augustus at about year 0 is now including everything in red. Let's see, yellow. Yeah, I think it's pretty much everything.
Wow.
Because they're going to gain control over the eastern Mediterranean coastline in those years also. So it's an extremely large empire. And a lot of the big cities that are still in Europe today, like Rome and Paris, and even eventually like some that are even in what is today Western Germany, like Bonn, those are kind of built in their first stage as Roman cities. So some of these cities are still around today, and sometimes even capital cities of powerful countries. Rome's biggest leap forward in technology for architecture is most likely concrete. Concrete is not completely a Roman invention. Other civilizations, especially Greeks and some in China, have used concrete before, but their early form of concrete was kind of liquid, so it wasn't very strong. And if water got into it through rain or through a flood, or if they try to build a pier or something into the water, that concrete the water would seep in and basically break it apart. So it wasn't extremely strong until the Romans come along, and they basically put additives into the concrete, especially a kind of volcanic ash from some of their local volcanoes, local mountains also, called Poxolana. And when they mixed that with other chemicals, basically like lime today, when they mix that volcanic ash with water mixture and they add in the lime, basically the lime and the volcanic ash has a chemical reaction where they bond very closely to each other, and their concrete becomes much, much, much stronger and longer lasting than any other concrete that ancient peoples had really ever used. So with this picture, you can see that the Romans still build with bricks and stone, and they'll use concrete as like the mortar between the bricks. And they'll often use their concrete as an outer layer over brick structures to keep the water out. Does that make sense? And with this style of concrete, they'll not just build places, stuff all over the physical ground. They'll start building underwater, which is a giant innovation. They can build piers and bridges and all kinds of things that will span large rivers and will last for a long time because the concrete is mostly water resistant. Now, every once in a while they have to rebuild something or update the building, but their buildings lasted much, much longer than most other ancient civilizations.
What was the element called that?
Poxolana.
Yeah. It was volcanic ash?
Yeah. or and mixed with like sand from the area too. Yeah.
And that's the smell.
Yeah. I mean, construction's a kind of dirty, tough business. I mean, still is today, right? So yeah. And not only did they get into using concrete to kind of solidify their structures, they also get into the idea of using arches to save building material. Instead of building an entire wall to like hold something up, a ceiling or a roof, or in this case an aqueduct, which we'll talk about a little bit later, instead of building a whole wall, they would save brick and concrete by creating open spaces in the wall and putting an arch over it. Because on this diagram, you have the weight of bricks coming down onto the arch, and this keystone in the center basically distributes the weight to the sides. And the weight will run down the pillars and will hold up the whole structure instead of having a gigantic wall. So all this empty space would have been filled in with more concrete and bricks. So they're saving building material and saving labor. And again, the Romans did not invent the arch, but they seem to learn about it from the Greeks. But they adapt it, and when they combine the arch with their concrete, they're going to build bigger buildings, taller buildings, with more internal space that's open. Does that make sense? All right.
No,
Hmm?
I didn't understand.
Well, their buildings are going to be taller because they're going to be more stable because of these arches and concrete. They're just going to be larger than any other buildings. Like we have this giant pillar right here, right? In big public buildings throughout all the ancient world, there would be pillars all over the place inside the building to hold up the roof. When they start using arches, they're going to distribute the weight around more, so the inside of the building is much more open space. And they start combining arches together within one space. So when they combine on this diagram, like the space A and D and C, when they line arches up all the way around the outside of a building, that makes that building larger, and you get like this circular kind of roof. Does that make sense? And they have other designs that will, basically slight architectural is more for just the way it looks. Instead of just having it rounded, they'll make it more arched.
More appealing.
Yeah, more appealing. Some people like that stuff. And the big trick of this is when they start doing this stuff, they don't need pillars everywhere inside their buildings to hold the thing up. They distribute the weight much more efficiently.
Because of the arch.
Yep. And combining the arch technology with the concrete technology. So, yeah, the Greeks had arches. They were using them, but they couldn't use them to this extent because they didn't have strong enough concrete. All right, so this is an example of what becomes known as a basilica style, which is basically a giant circular roof, which is really just a combination of all these different kind of arches all the way around a circle. And one of the most important innovations for this is it doesn't even have a keystone at the top. It has an open space because all the arches reinforce each other along the kind of upper rim. And number one, having that open space at the top was kind of like the architect showing off. But it also lets in a lot of natural light. So a lot of kind of, especially religious buildings like temples, were often very dark inside. And now you can go into a building and there's natural light. You don't need to spend money on candles or wherever else you need to light the place. And this is a kind of giant breakthrough. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a lot of these the architects who wrote books on how to do this, a lot of those books like got lost or burned or destroyed or something. And afterward, the Europeans forget how to do this stuff for a long time. They struggle for almost 1,000 years trying to figure out how to do it again. So these are major leaps forward in architectural technology. And you can see the difference with an Egyptian building. Internally, you have all these columns everywhere getting in people's way. Does that make sense? Because they weren't using big, powerful arches to hold the ceiling up, to hold the roof up. So for large, tall buildings, they have to have all these pillars everywhere. And that was common in the ancient world. So it's very different to go to something like this where it's all internally open. So you can bring more people in at once. People can move around easier. So it's a different experience for people who go into these buildings. And they'll keep scaling it up bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're going to build gigantic basilicas. Just like today, I mean, builders and contractors and architects get into basically personal rivalries to see who can build the biggest building, or all kinds of crazy things. It's still going on in the world today, right? Yeah. All right. Let's see. So the city of Rome itself, as we said before, was built. The original part of the city was built on the tops of all these hills, and they kind of have bridges connecting each of the hills. And the lowlands were basically swamps at first. So that's the original phase of the city itself in the 700s. And over time, as Roman influence and power and prosperity grow, they want to add land to their city, and the easiest, or the most impressive, maybe not the easiest, but the most ambitious way of doing that is to drain the swamps and cover the ground that's now exposed. Cover it with streets and buildings and whatnot, and those become known as the forums that we've talked about before. You remember this? They drain the swamps and they build these basically marketplaces, these malls that they call forums. And because a lot of people are going to these malls on a daily basis, politicians eventually start kind of using them as places to make speeches to try to eventually win elections after you get the plebiscite. So some buildings and areas in the forums are even redesigned to be public meeting spaces and spaces for public addresses, people to talk, politicians to talk to the public. So we've gone over this before, right? Sound familiar? All right. So this is another image of Rome, the city itself, at the height of its development. And let's see, about the early 100s after zero, 100 AD, 100 CE. And you can see it's just massively built up. It's way beyond just the hilltops by this point. They drained all the swamps and it's all constructed. So it's a bustling city with a large population, and a ton of these buildings are public buildings. The majority of the buildings in Rome are public places. They're not privately owned. They're built at government expense for the people, the citizens. So all the forums are technically for the citizens. The giant amphitheater is up there in the kind of top right corner on this map. So that's the Colosseum, the famous Colosseum, part of which is still around today. They had a giant racetrack that they called the Circus Maximus. The big circuit, basically, where they held races. So talk about some of these really quick. The biggest forum was the Forum of Trajan, which was built to honor one of the eventual emperors. When really start talking about the emperors yet, but they have about 100 years or so of really powerful emperors that make up really a royal family after a while. And a lot of these emperors decide to have marketplaces, forums built in their own honor and named after them at public expense. So this is something that politicians do to kind of solidify the idea that they'll never be forgotten, basically. Does that make sense? So these are monuments to their own fame, built in their own lifetime, under their own leadership. The Forum of Trajan is the biggest one. It's absolutely massive. And it's built in, there's several different pieces of it. The welcome area was this part right here in the middle called the Basilica Oppia. And this is an image of just that part of it with a couple people standing in there. So just the entryway is massive. It's estimated to be about 400 feet long and about 130 feet high. It is huge. And this is just the entryway. So once you entered the place, basically if you this is the hallway to get in. If you turn to the left and go that way, you enter the actual, I think it was it's the kind of like honorable place for Trajan. Yeah, you cross past his monument basically, and you go into the kind of sanctum where he's supposedly buried. After a while, these emperors become thought to be living gods. And if you turn to the right, once you're in the hallway, then you go into the forum, which is the marketplace and the political place. Does that make sense? So this giant thing, the basilica, is literally just the foyer, the entry room. And you can see how many columns are along the sides and how tall this thing is relative to these people down here. It's unbelievably massive. And if you, let's see, yeah, there's a column. If you go in and you turn on this map to the left and you start walking toward the kind of sanctum of Trajan, basically, you go past a column out here in this kind of outdoor area where they literally had a column sitting there, and it's still there today. It's called the Column of Trajan. It's about 125 feet tall, so it is huge. And you can see that, we usually don't build fences very much taller than actual people, right? And what's the point in building a fence that's 50 feet tall? You only need a fence that's 10 feet tall to keep someone out. So here's maybe about twice the size of a person compared to the size of the overall thing. So the column itself is basically engraved with stories about how great Trajan is. So there's an extreme amount of artistry to basically tell his life story and all the great things he did. So it's a kind of winding story that kind of winds around the column. And if that was all unraveled, we estimate it would be about 600 feet long. So the thing is huge, and I'm pretty sure there's a statue of him at the top.
How old is that picture?
Oh, this picture? I have to look it up. To me, it looks like 1980s, but the column itself didn't change very much, so. No. But it's still there, and it's a public space. You can still go see it in Rome today.
It's not black anymore.
No. Ah.
They redo it.
I don't know. I don't have the money to go to Rome and look at these things. But that's just a column that's out there to tell his story before you walk into his kind of worship site, basically. And let's see. And the other side is just a forum, kind of marketplace. But Trajan's Forum is the biggest one that the Romans ever built. There's another part of the city from a previous emperor named Nero. He basically built this kind of a mansion with an internal theater, the enclosed theater. And Nero is, let's see, Nero's around about 25 years or so. And somewhere around there, 25, 30 years after Augustus' death. I can never remember his exact years. He's not around for very long. Because a lot of the public accused him of spending money on himself, basically. He builds this to be his own palace. But also an entertainment place for his friends. So it's not just a building. There is a man-made lake outside that's surrounded with gardens for his guests to kind of walk around and relax. The Golden House, its most famous part was the theater, basically, where it was enclosed. It had a roof, so they could watch plays or do whatever, watch music performances, whatever they want to do that day. And reportedly, it had a ceiling that moved somehow. They figured out how to engineer to rotate the ceiling, and reportedly, when you looked at the ceiling, it would be lit from behind, so there's a space with a light behind it, or a series of lights, and the ceiling would be poked through with holes to have an exact replica of the night sky, stars in the sky at night. And they'd have workers up there rotating the thing to mimic exactly, if you walked outside, what you would be seeing in the sky at that moment. Yeah, and built at extreme expense. And reportedly had these, you guys know what misters are? If you go out to the desert and you're hanging out, to cool you down, they have these misters that kind of drop little misting water on you to keep you cool. They have misters in this place over the audience that would mist perfume down on the audience. So it was like this extremely extravagant, ridiculously expensive building. And there was a statue of Nero put out front, 100 feet tall, so he would welcome all his guests in statue form as they entered. Yeah.
So why exactly is it called the Golden House?
It's not made out of gold, but it's so expensive to build that, and it becomes legendary within Rome. The problem is that the damn thing burned down. Apparently they're partying a little bit too much one day, and they burned down the whole building.
It was known also as the Nero's Arcade House.
Yeah. It's basically his fun house.
Yes.
And Nero is really into partying in extravagant ways. So Nero is often defined as one of these real elitist that is just leading a really fun party lifestyle, to put it pretty bluntly. And eventually did him in because people become so upset at him. And symbolically, this building, this thing symbolizes to a lot of Romans that this royal family is in control. They're doing whatever they want. They don't have to listen to the people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That when it burned down, a lot of Romans actually celebrated. And so that was humiliating for him. And he's a conspiracy is eventually built against him to assassinate him, to kill him off. And he kills himself before they can get to him. So that's his end.
It was bad.
Yeah. Especially within the history of Christianity, because this is after year zero, so there's Christians around, and apparently when this building burned down, a lot of Christians hate the Roman Empire for obvious reasons. So a lot of Christians, the story says that they're out in the street outside the burning building dancing, thinking that this is the end of the Roman Empire. And when Nero found out about that, he had a bunch of them arrested and killed. So within Christianity, he's often described as an antichrist because he killed off so many Christians. But it's a dangerous thing when you're out there partying away right across the street from where the king's house is burning down. Might not be the best idea that people ever had. But you take your chances when you do these things, right? Ah.
What
The hell's going on there? I think we'll quit that. So yeah, that's real quickly another sign of the extravagance and power, and engineering and technological heights that they had reached, that they can build something like this. It's really pretty amazing. But this is not how the average people lived. The average workforce they're not rich. Some of them make a decent living, but the average workers, especially in the city of Rome itself, the average employees are usually pretty poor. They're not paid very well, and a lot of them aren't really able to quit their jobs because they work for these powerful families. If they quit, they'll be ostracized to the point of starvation. They might not be able to get another job. So a lot of these employees are in a pretty bad place, and they are often living in what we today basically call slum housing. The Roman government builds a huge amount of basically publicly owned apartments in giant tenement buildings, sometimes that are as big as a city block. I mean, huge, huge buildings for the time. So these are some of the tallest buildings in Rome, along with the forums and palaces and whatnot. But, you get conditions in these places where you have poor people living. They sometimes live like a whole family to just one room in the apartment. They have to share the apartment with other families. You've heard of these kind of slum conditions? No? They obviously didn't have plumbing or what we today think of as plumbing. Or electricity back then. But the wealthier palaces had their own water supply. The rich had water being piped in that they paid for. So they could, fill up their water glass or cook with the water that's being pumped into their private homes. And they also had a kind of plumbing system to flush out all the human waste, right? These places don't have that. People in these places, if they want water, they have to go down to the public fountains and, fill a bucket up with water and bring it back home. And actually selling water is a big deal. It's big business in these areas. Just like you buy a bottle of water for whatever from a store, you have people out on the street selling water and making money off it. So that's how badly, especially the poor, had to live in these areas, and they don't have plumbing. They don't even really have public sewers around. So what do they do with all the human waste from their apartment? They throw it on the street, literally just into the street. And the city government did not have street cleaning operations very consistently, so there's a lot of disease, right? Because you just pile up all that crap outside your living space. And you've got the water that you're using kind of traveling through it, right? Like not physically, getting into it, but just carrying it above all this waste that's all over the place. Sanitation and health is not very good if you're living in these mass public buildings. And it's a giant proportion of the buildings in Rome are built for the poor people. Does that make sense? So the vast majority of people are living like this. They're not living like Nero. Nero is the 0.1% of the overall population. It's just like, I don't know if we talked about this in this class. You ever go to Hollywood and just kind of take a look around there? They have some hotels that you can walk through the lobby of the hotel. And they're like lined with marble and all kinds of craziness. I challenge you to just go to the bathroom in one of those places. They got toilets made out of gold. I mean, that's not even a joke. That's real. And you can go use them if you want. You've got faucets made out of gold in those hotels. It's, whatever direction that is. It's that way somewhere. But yeah, you can go in that area, just park your car and just walk around for a couple hours and see how some people live. It's really pretty amazing.
Good time.
Use the bathroom, yeah, I guess. But because it's in the lobby, it's technically open to the public. if you want to get a room at that hotel, I hear it costs at least $10,000 a night. $10,000 for one night to stay in the place. So that's outside of my budget. But there's some people that have that kind of money, and they like to live like that. You've heard of such things? Yeah? No? You have now. So those kinds of inequalities are still in society.
That is called.
And when I was last in that area, I was looking around and I just got mad. And these people get to live like this, and I'm living like this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Here's a kind of chart of the Forum as it became known eventually, the Colosseum, or not the Forum, the Colosseum. One of the funny things about Nero's Golden House burning down is suddenly you have a bunch of vacant land kind of close to the city, valuable land that is technically public land. And now that Nero's dead, the next emperor that comes to power and retains power, when Nero dies, it starts another civil war we'll talk about later. But when Nero dies, all of the house is still burned down. He hasn't really built anything in its place yet. So the next emperor comes along and says, we're going to build a large public building for the people. It's not going to be for the rich, for their fun house. It's going to be for the people. And this becomes eventually the Colosseum, built on the exact ground where the Golden House was. And Vespasian is the emperor who, in year 70 CE, 70 years after Zero, announced this project to build this Colosseum. And it takes 10 years to construct the thing. And it is massive. So this is the same computer model of what the Colosseum looked like that we used before when we talked about the gladiators. The Colosseum is built out of stone and concrete. The seats are all made out of marble. So they are public seating, survives the elements. There is special seating for like VIPs, like government leaders and real rich people who want to pay a lot for tickets to sit closer to the action. But the vast majority of the seating was free. It's a public building. If you want to go see the boxing match, you just go on in. You don't have to buy a ticket. As long as until the thing fills up. Does that make sense? So it's for the people to enjoy themselves. They're the taxpayers of the Roman Empire, and so Vespasian says, build this for their enjoyment. And the engineering behind it is really pretty amazing. They update the thing over the decades to make it kind of even more impressive. The VIP seats, they eventually piped water in underneath the seats to keep the seats warm in the wintertime. So they'd run hot water underneath the seat to keep the chair warm. And in the summertime, when it was hot and kind of humid out, they'd run cold water underneath it to keep the chair cool. So we had a kind of like an air conditioning type system for the VIP section. Everyone else just has to kind of sit out there. They don't have access to that. But eventually, from what we hear from testimony from people who saw this, they eventually figured out how to pull a canvas over the whole thing to shield the people from the sun when it got real hot out in the summertime, so they can sit in the shade and watch all these things. Which there's many Romans who wrote about this and were amazed at it, and it took up until just like 20 years ago for modern engineers to figure out how they did it with the technology that they had. Art historians and people who study architecture have been trying to figure it out for decades and decades. How did they accomplish this with the tools they had? And they finally figured it out really not too long ago, the past couple decades. 20 years ago historically is not very long ago. And here's what the Colosseum looks like today. So a lot of it is kind of falling apart, especially after Rome eventually collapses and the city got invaded and parts of it burned. So you can see the major seating, and this is what the Colosseum looked like without the floor. on the arena. We know that they eventually dug out the floor and dug tunnels underneath so that celebrities and stars and athletes can kind of pop up in the middle of the Coliseum without having to walk in, for a dramatic effect for the audience. So there's all kinds of like catacombs underneath where fighters and weapons are stored. And they also put animals in there and had basically elevators that they would use to basically a piece of the floor would kind of open up like a trap door and something or someone would pop up, come running out. So if two gladiators are fighting and the crowd is really on one of the guy's side, and if that guy gets killed and the last gladiator standing is kind of being booed, they can pop up a tiger to eat him. Or they can pop them up while they're still fighting. They do all kinds of crazy things. And here's a picture of one of the elevator shafts in the Colosseum. And just in the last 10 years or so, in the early 2000s, some engineers using the tools of the time figured out how they actually did this. Basically with a counterweight system, a pulley system. But they could throw a bunch of stuff up there, and there's reports of all kinds of exotic animals being put in the elevators and thrown up to the floor of the arena. We know from testimony that every once in a while they would flood the floor of the arena with water, so they made it watertight, so that they can bring in like miniature boats and have naval warfare as entertainment. So some gladiators fought on boats, harming each other. So the engineering behind doing all this is beyond anything I can really understand very well. But there's plenty of documentaries out there describing how they do this stuff, so it's pretty amazing. And here's the outside of the Colosseum today, and it's kind of an intersection of a few major streets today, and it's one of the big tourist sites in all of Europe today. So there's tons of pictures, especially of this kind of image. And you can see how many arches they used, right, to hold up the building. So there's a lot of empty space, and basically each arch kind of becomes a walkway to go in. And in its time, each arch had a statue of a different politician or a famous gladiator. So as you entered the public building, you would walk past one of these big statues, and there's a computer rendering of what it might have looked like at the time. You can see all the statues and the arches facing out to the public. But again, it's the public gets in for free. And there's announcements of what fights are on what day and all that kind of modern advertising that we even have today. And reportedly, gambling was a big thing at the Colosseum. That there would be gamblers in the archways and in the walkways, making bets and all these kinds of things. No, you pointing at the statue?
Yeah.
We think that's the statue of Nero, which survived the fire at the Golden House, and since it's already 100 feet tall and really impressive, they kept it around as one of the entrance ways, one of the directions that you would get into the Colosseum. Yeah. So yeah. All right, and again, this is a map of the city at the height of the empire. So you see several different major forums. The amphitheater, the Colosseum, is way up there, kind of in the corner. And there's a forum for Vespasian. That's the guy who ordered the construction of the Colosseum. But he was already old by the time he got to be the king, so he didn't live long enough to see the thing actually open. His son opened the Colosseum. There's all kinds of different stadiums and public housing, all kinds of things, different arenas. And here's the circus, the racetrack down here on the bottom side of the map. And there's Again, a rendering of what the Circus Maximus likely would have looked like. It's estimated that each side of the track was about 5,000 feet long. So it's basically a 2-mile racetrack. You can start on one side and race. Usually they have the most famous thing, the most popular thing was chariot races with horses. So they'd run for a mile, and then they'd obviously have to slow down when they made the turns, which apparently a lot of chariot drivers died in attempting, because they're going as fast as possible, and now they have to turn and slow down at the same time, and there's a lot of crashes. So much like the gladiators, they die out there by themselves.
Need for Speed.
Yeah, the race teams were at first private companies. Or not companies, but private individuals, almost like gladiators themselves, who were known for being the best drivers, basically. And then drivers start kind of selling their services to racing companies. So a racing company will own several drivers, and then you get rivalries of different teams of drivers. So they become like race teams, basically. And at the height of the empire, you have 4 major different race teams, and they all had their specific colors and their specific flags and all those kinds of things, and they race each other, which included sometimes attempts at attacking each other, even on the race course, throwing things at each other or trying to stab each other or something like that. They all carried a knife on them in case they made a mistake somewhere and they fall out of their chariot, but if their hands get wrapped up in the reins, the horse might drag them for a mile or so, which could kill them. So they all carried a knife on their arm to cut the reins in case something bad happened. But this is also a center of gambling. So Romans are very much entertained by this kind of stuff. Does that make sense? Okay. Another big thing that they do is they don't just build up their city with all these different kind of public buildings. They also want to make sure that their city has the needed resources. And one way they do that is to build all these roads all over the place that we talk about, have talked about before, at least a little bit. So they have goods and services and people moving in and out of the city and all over the empire through the road networks. Rome comes to be the most populated city in all of Europe in its time, by far. There's hundreds of thousands of people living in Rome. And whenever you get that amount of people together, you have to at least guarantee that there's food supply, water supply, and housing. And water became a big need as the city grew. So the Roman government started investing very heavily in building up a predictable, consistent water supply to be brought into the city. Basically, they don't want to rely on companies going out with wagons and buckets, going out to a lake and filling up and bringing that water to the city. It's too expensive and not guaranteed that it's actually going to work. So the government starts building aqueducts, which are infrastructure like roads to carry water. And you can see with this aqueduct that they use concrete, they use arches right down into the riverbed to build up the size of basically a wall that will allow the river to flow over the top. Does that make sense? Some of these aqueducts go very long. Like this one in today's France is 31 miles long. Because where does the water come from?
Rivers.
Well, rivers. But what physically makes the water?
Rain.
There's some rain. But remember, Italy is surrounded by mountains, right? It's almost entirely mountainous. So most of the water in Italy comes from melting snow. Does that make sense? And since they have all these mountains fairly nearby, they build all these aqueducts up into the mountains where the snow melts and brings water down just through gravity. So they basically just connect the aqueduct system and through gravity bring the water to the city. Because gravity is fairly predictable, right? That creates another problem, though, especially for something that's like 30 miles long. The aqueduct has to start really tall. And it has to be a very consistent, steady downhill angle all the way to the city, right? Because that's how the water is going to flow. You don't want to have the aqueduct going way up and then way down, because the water will overflow and you'll have all kinds of problems. It has to be perfectly consistent, no matter what gets in the way. So if you have, your aqueduct system is like dug into the ground, and then you get to this thing where suddenly the ground drops, you have to build a bridge. And that bridge has to continue that perfect downgrade all the way across. And what happens if you get to a mountain? What happens if there's a mountain in your way or a hill?
Kirby.
You can go around it, but a lot of times they go through it. They dig tunnels through mountains at extreme cost to continue that water flowing. And they had a cap on top of it, usually made out of wood, to keep birds and kinds of animals out there from getting to their water, to protect it. But if you took the cap off and you just looked at the top of it, it would look like a man-made river, basically, moving downhill and eventually going all the way down into the city. And they don't just build them in Rome. They build aqueducts for all their major cities. This one is in modern-day Turkey, way in Eastern Europe. They build them in France. They build them, or what is today France, what they called Gaul. They build them in Iberia, which is today Spain and Portugal. They build these aqueducts everywhere because they realize that their growing populations need water supply. And this is another way that their form of concrete comes really handy, because you have to have a watertight bridge system if the water's flowing over the top of it the whole time. Does that make sense?
But now the water's all dried up, so basically it's just all for looks.
Well, a lot of it doesn't work anymore, not just because it's, the snow doesn't melt as much anymore, but because modern systems with plumbing and electricity and whatnot are taking the water out of the original supply. So a lot of them are dry, but they're still there. And they're all over Europe.
So basically
In North
it's
Africa.
advanced to more
We
efficient
have,
stuff.
yeah, we have more modern pumping systems. But the biggest city in the United States, New York City, did not bring in enough, the equal amount of water as Rome did until like 1986. So with all of our modern technology, the Roman system for getting water into their city was more efficient until just a few decades ago. With all of our modern electricity and pumping and all that kind of stuff. So the Romans have way more water supply in their population centers than any other civilization in the world. I mean, bar none. It's not even close. And that's one reason that the Romans think they're so much superior than everyone else. They think they're better because they're cleaner. They can bathe more because they have this water supply. They eat better. They can wash off their food. They can cook more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. They think they're better than others just because they're cleaner. So that's part of their arrogance. And that's one of the reasons they eventually collapse. They never think that these outsiders, these barbarians, can ever do any damage to us. I mean, look at them, smell them. They ain't gonna attack us. Does it make sense? No. A lot of there's really three kind of major endpoints for the water system, especially in the city of Rome. Number one, when the water arrived at the city, they'd have like these big, kind of almost like underground water tanks to store the water until it's going to be used. And they developed early kinds of pumping methods, especially to bring water into the government buildings, especially where the emperor and his family and head administrators are. So they get water as much as they want in pretty much unlimited quantity because they're the leaders of government. So that's one endpoint for the water. Number two is, and a lot of wealthier Romans paid a government tax, a service charge basically, to get water pumped into their homes and businesses. But most of the water went to publicly accessible places. So these water fountains are very large in Rome. You've seen a big outdoor fountain where it's just kind of spurting water in all kinds of different ways, and there's all designs. And there's usually like a pool of water that you can just kind of look at. Today we just look at it, but in ancient Rome, in the city itself, they, poor people would come up with buckets and take the water,
Did they
take it home.
get charged for the water and using the public bath?
At the baths,
Uh-huh.
most of these are public buildings. Some rich people will build an outbuilding at their house, and it would be private for them. But the most famous, really big ones, they're completely public.
But I mean, people pay for use it, or?
No, it's public. You can walk
Okay.
in just being a Roman citizen. So the baths are basically like what we today call like spas. They're places to go relax. They have pools for like swimming pools. They have saunas. They have cold water. They have heated water. They have it pumped all over the place in the building. So depending which room you go into, it has different kinds of resources. Does that make sense? And it was open to the public. And the most famous ones are the baths at Carcalla, which I think is in, if I remember right, it's in southern Britain, which the Romans eventually conquered. The floor plan is pretty massive. This slide, the previous one, is that's the remains of it. That's what still exists today. But the floor plan, you can see how many individual rooms they had. So this is a massive building. And each room had its own kind of specialty. Extremely hot water, or massages, or different kinds of soaps, and all kinds of things. And the other side had the colder water areas or pools, or they even put basically a big gym in a couple other rooms. So these are like public spas and gyms, and it's all built at government expense. These are public buildings.
Free.
Yeah, they're accessible and free to citizens. So the Romans look at this stuff and they say, "Wow, our government's spending a lot of money, but we're getting a lot of benefit from it. We can use these roads and aqueducts and baths and forums," and they see the government working for them. And the government's even building these giant tenement houses for the poor. And I think I have a painting. Yeah, there's a painting of the interior, the kind of hallway, or one of the big hallways of one of the baths, or one of the hallways at Carcalla. And I mean, just the height of it, you can see all the arches, the intertwining arches. So you have this giant kind of empty space in the middle. You can see the statues of different leaders. And these little blips down here are people. So these are massive interior buildings, built to a scale that no one had ever really seen before. And especially not with gigantic pillars holding the whole thing up. You have the pillars off to the side that you kind of walk between to get into the halls. But this is like monumental. This is like unthinkable. And again, after the Roman Empire collapses, and a lot of the books that describe how this stuff is built architecturally, scientifically, they get lost or burned or destroyed or whatever. Later Europeans in what we call the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, some of these buildings are still around. And some of these, dark age Europeans walk into this place and they think, there's no way humans could have actually built something like this. So some of them are like converted to religious buildings. Some of them are, you have testimonies from Europeans in the Middle Ages saying like, it must have been giants that built this. Like no human can have accomplished anything like this because they've forgotten, they've lost the information on how to actually do it. And it takes them about 1,000 years to get going again on figuring it out again. Does that make sense? So that's another reason that the Roman Empire is often seen as the kind of foundation of modern European culture and learning and philosophy and all kinds of things. So, good with that one? Questions about that?
Did you mention the height of these?
Oh, I don't know about Carcalla. I'd have to look that one up.
But those are people down there?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's unbelievable. So, I mean, I was impressed when they finished the library here in Fontana, the big public library. You walk in there, it's pretty awesome.
Lewiston?
Is that what it's called? I can't remember. Everything in this area is named after Lewis. You know who those people are, right?
Lewis?
The Lewis family.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Lewis family. You know what they do around? Why is everything named after them? No, they didn't own the steel company. They are real estate developers. So they help build these suburbs. And they planned out these streets and built all these houses, or a lot of them. They made so much money that they can donate millions of dollars to have a public library built, and they want their name on it.